Hey Tommy, I have a question.
Go ahead.
How how does a Marxist jerk off?
Uh, I don't know how.
By seizing the means of reproduction.
Yeah, that's not too crude in my book.
Hey,
uh,
look, I'm not. It's not. Obviously, I found the joke and found it funny. So I just
I mean, like one of my hardest personal struggles right now has been okay, and a little bit of a sidebar here. I'm not a staunch believer in the idea of policing curse words. But that being said, I don't want my child's first word to be fuck, and he learned it from me. So trying to mitigate some of my cursing in a stressful environment over the past few weeks has been a
yeah.
thing I'm
No,
gradually getting better at.
I feel yeah. Like there's um a legitimate uh thing about like I don't have a problem with cursing, and as my kids have gotten slightly older, I've become more prone to doing that sort of thing around them. But like there's definitely the reality that like they're children, and like just in general, like all morality teaching with children involves teaching them very easy rules that are very simple and very wrong and unnuanced. So it's like, don't hit things, like don't hit people, that's not okay. And then you have to later sort of like take that extremely simple model and like tweak it a bit, like, well, there's some people, you got to defend yourself, if you're getting attacked, or you got to do this or that. And to me, cursing is the same sort of thing. It's like, okay, don't say these words because you don't know the appropriate way to administer them in your language, the appropriate places to use them. And then, as they get older, be like, all right, just like don't say them in front of grandma or whatever, because um
Yeah,
and
no, I agree. And I think this actually brings us to an important element of this week's episode of talking about a concept that has to be simplified early into our understanding of politics that has to then be unsimplified at some point. And I think for a great many people, even people who are elected politicians, it never gets unsimplified. But first, let's talk about who we are because we haven't actually introduced ourselves in this intro 20 minutes later. Uh, you're listening to Raise 'em Left. I had to. It's been so long since we've recorded. I had to think about what this podcast is called.
Tommy
I,
has been enjoying his time with a infant, so
yes, I have a 5 week old in the house right now, and it was stressful week one and two, and then it was pretty chill for a couple of weeks, and then now it's back to like I just want sleep
yeah.
constantly, and I've been working with infant, and that is a thing that is going to be very soon coming to a close, where I will only be stay at home parenting. But yeah, no, this whole working during the first 6 weeks of having a child at home is bullshit, and you should go listen to our episode about parental leave because we should burn some things down until we get that. But stepping back from burning things down for political reasons, what are we talking about this week?
We are wrapping up our discussion on horseshoe theory. Before we kind of talked about um, how it relates to a couple of different parenting styles and how they kind of um, end up feeling like similar in like their outcomes, and like even though they're radically different. So there's this sense of like, oh, there seems to be this sort of like horseshoe parenting styles between latchkey parenting and helicopter parenting, where like one is very neglectful and one is very like interventionist, but like both end up having negative outcomes. And like the question is like, we hear this around politics a lot. uh the horseshoe theory is like, oh, the extreme left and the extreme right are both like extremists, and uh, therefore bad. And it's a more centrist sort of position that's like actually the different one from the more extremes. And so the question is like, is that comparison fair? Like what if one of them is apt and one of them is not, like why? Uh, and that's what we'll kind of be talking about.
I agree. Um, and I think a way to sort of begin this is, like, and you've kind of hit on a element here that I wanted to hit on. But that is like directly comparing horseshoe parenting and latchkey parenting to these kind of political realms. And this is going to
You
be
mean helicopter parenting and
what?
latchkey parenting? You
Yes. What
said
did I say?
horseshoe
Oh,
parenting, is
horseshoe
just
parenting. Yes.
for the
Yeah, yeah. No,
lack of confusion.
helicopter parenting and latchkey parenting. So we've compared latchkey parenting to the concept of a free market conservative. So the market performs best when it's left relatively alone. It self-regulates. Government regulations aren't needed. You have these perceived positive effects of a greater development of dependence, reliability, self-sufficiency, all these wonderfully great things, but we have a bunch of measured negative effects, such as predation and abuse of workers. Child abuse is something that is heavily documented in latchkey parenting situations. Decreased freedom of the market because the market is just controlled by market leaders. Kids don't actually have that much self-sufficiency because when you remove parents from the authority, from the role of parenting, often somebody else slides into that role, often an older sibling or even just older kids in the neighborhood or or a babysitter or somebody else slides into that role, and often it's somebody who is looking to slide into a role to abuse a role. We see increased rates of loneliness, boredom, and fear. We see increased rates of behavioral outbursts, and we see increased rates of anxiety and depression. And then on the helicopter parenting, the kind of comparison there is to a neoliberal political framework. So the market performs best when it's extremely tightly regulated by a state authority, or children operate best when they're extremely well regulated by a parental authority. An intense belief exists in this, in the validity of institutions and the goodwill of the free market. So the free market means to do good, but the institutions need to just help keep it in check. I often see this like said as a checks and balances, that like government regulators are the checks and balances to the free market. And you see the same kind of a thing happening in parenting here, where the it's you know they need some, like the idea that kids need to develop, and they need to do that under the check and balance of constant not necessarily constant supervision, but constant dictation of what their day is going to be. We talked
Yeah,
about like
when
the
things
hyper
start to
scheduling.
go, sorry, I was
No,
just gonna
no, you're
say,
good.
like with neoliberalism, like sometimes the market goes off the rails and you got to have the regulations to tie them in. Sometimes your kid's life goes off the rails and you got to intervene to bring it in. Maybe they're not getting the right grade and it's going to stop them from college, so you got to go yell at a teacher to get the right grade on there so that it doesn't sabotage their future. Or maybe they're not achieving in the way that you think that they should be by that point. You have this sort of idealized idea of how a child's life should go, and you use intervention to keep it on that path, because that's your model of what the correct or good sort of life looks like. And
Yes.
similarly to neoliberalism, they have an idea of how a market should function and what it should look like when it's doing that. But sometimes you get these monopolies or we get these other things, and we gotta rein that in, because that is going off the rails, as it were, but with no analysis oftentimes as to why it's going off the rails, or what might be the cause of or whether or not your model, for example, of how a market or a child should be is flawed in some way, uh, contradictory perhaps in some way.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, yeah, no, very much. And so, like, along with this, you get this kind of concept that any problems that do arise there aren't a problem with or they're not a problem with the market itself. Like the market can't be doing the system in which all of this market as existing can't be the problem. The problem is that you need to overregulate. You need to continue doing that regulation. And the same thing with a lot of parents who get really wrapped into this helicopter parenting. Every time their child stumbles in life, well, the problem can't be the life that's existing around them. The problem can't be our society and our structures of things. The problem is that, well, they need to really just pull up their own bootstraps by
Yeah.
us giving them the structured things to do.
So if you want like a more like in-depth discussion on that, that's kind of a summary of the past two things. And then the comparison here is, similarly, like with, both of these have similar outcomes, right? Like there's or both for helicopter parenting and latchkey parenting, there's a lot of similar outcomes in like increased anxiety and depression, increased rates of child predation, um, just a lot of these kind of similar negative outcomes that might lead one to look at them, that although they operate on very, very different value systems in terms of like how and when to intervene in a child's life, they both are bad. They both have bad outcomes. And this, sounds very similar in its structure to like horseshoe theory, like with politics, which is the idea that like the extreme right and the extreme left end up saying a lot of the same things. They end up sounding a lot the same, and that they are ideologically very similar to each other. And it's actually like the centrists or the neoliberals, sort of that are the ones that are, different, that are more reasonable or whatever. And I don't think that comparison holds up personally, just because I think there's a couple of reasons. The first is that like in one case, in the parenting case, like we're talking about outcomes seeming similar, versus in the political arena with horseshoe theory, we're talking more about aesthetics being similar, which is a very important distinction. And then the other one is like there's just a general problem in all of these that's like, this is a multi-dimensional problem with lots of different facets, and looking at it from a certain lens, things can look very similar to each other. But looking at it from, another direction, another angle, from another type of analysis, shows some like pretty stark differences between them. And we can go into, some of that or whatever, but that's kind of my broad top level take on the whole thing.
Yeah, no, I think there's some validity there. I do, and I do though. I do. I disagree in that I do see. Well, I wouldn't say that. Of course, it's a one-to-one comparison here, but I think it can, in many ways, serve as kind of a learning tool, right? It's like the idea of taking a broader political concept and boiling it down to talk about it in a household concept, which often is a very can be a manipulative way to talk about politics, right? When they're like, well, in my household, I make sure that I balance my budget, and we need to do the same thing with the government. That can be a very manipulative tactic, because you're again talking about two very different systems. But I think in a broader sense of talking about politic, it can be helpful. But I do agree with you. Yeah, like if you can definitely look at these, I was a little unsure as I was writing some of the script work about how on the nose I was, because this is actually a political concept that I'm not completely concrete on, because, well, I'm not a theorist. I'm not a political theorist. I'm more in, I don't know, other I don't know how to say where my political theory education is. I am very, I guess I would say that I'm very young in my in my education with political theory. But I do see a lot of comparison in the same kind of way of like we talked about before. Specifically, there being a through line with conservative household management and conservative parenting into conservative politics. And one of these kind of elements that I do see, like in that, is like it's reactionary behavior, and reactionary behavior working its way through parenting in the same way that it works its way through conservative politic. And then also, I would argue, reactionary behavior working its way through neoliberal politic in the same way that it operates through helicopter parenting, right? It's still operating on a reactionary function. And this is where I get to where, like, I think in some ways, of course, there is some idiom of truth to a horseshoe theory of what you're perceiving, of like, well, there's similarities to these two things. There is, I would argue that neoliberals and conservatives are, which are more in the, arguably more in the center, are operating off of a lot of reactionary basis. And when you go out to that outside and you see people sometimes operating outside of a reactionary basis, you can draw your comparisons there and things like that, and other elements here that kind of draw into a comparison. But that doesn't make the analysis of the horseshoe correct. So, like, specifically one of these, when we were talking about, I'm trying to rewind in my head, we were talking about how we kind of compare like political theory now to like, okay, so in history, and when we look at history, we like to talk about how history repeats. Something happens today, oh well, it's the same as this thing that happened 20 or 30 years ago. One of the interesting things that we don't do very much in history is when we look at analysis of things 100 years ago, we don't as often compare it to something that happened 200 years before that. And part of that is because we're better at contextualizing that into saying that, now, yes, World War One and the Napoleonic Wars had similarities in that they were global conflicts, but they were wildly and ridiculously different for a bunch of other reasons, so you can't necessarily compare those. But we will look at modern politics and like reactionary conservative politics and the rise of fascism in the modern world, and feel necessitated to compare it to the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany, and like, well, if this fascism doesn't look like Nazis, then it's not true fascism. But we would never look at the expansion of empire and colonization in World War One and then find like, well, okay, unless that looks exactly like the expansion of empire and colonization in the 18th century, then one isn't like, then one can't be imperialization and colonization. Like, we wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, you can see this kind of phenomenon in historical analysis when it comes to just like kind of the broad discourse about modes of production in general. Like you have people who, say like, oh, like socialism is this like really nice sounding idea of like, let's like make everything more equitable and, make, distribute wealth and make sure everyone kind of has like a solid baseline and all that kind of stuff. But, it's not realistic. Like, that's just, how could people ever like get, how could you ever get this thing that would rely upon it? It would always like fall to corruption or greed or whatever. But the thing is like, you can go back in time and find people who were writing at the dawn of so as capitalism was beginning to emerge and really fight for its right to exist against feudalism, right? You have a lot of people like, academics or royals or whatever who are like writing things about how like, oh, it's like obviously uh nice to imagine that like, we could just let people open these sorts of things and they don't need approval of the crown, and like maybe, it's just like some sort of, but realistically, we have this, God-given right to rule, and we don't want, these people, we don't just want random people by some market to decide like what, is good and bad. Like we need, you know the kings are God's voice on earth, and like that, there's just same sort of thing of like being like, it's a nice idea but it's not realistic. And it's a very different sort of justification in, when talking about like defending feudalism versus defending capitalism now. um it's not one-to-one comparison. You can't just be like, oh, these are exactly the same sort of criticisms and it's just like history repeating itself. I think often the analogy that I've heard before when it comes to this sort of thing is like, history doesn't really repeat itself, it just rhymes.
Mm-hmm.
And I see this as a kind of a rhyme, like it's got a similar structure to the criticisms of socialism now as being unrealistic or too idealistic, or not having like a clear path forward, strike me as similar to those in a way that you go like, okay, I mean, it's important to take the meat of that and say, like, when we're building our ideas about what a socialism should look like, we should make sure that we're considering, is this stable? Is it good? Will it sustain itself? Like, can it handle all the things that needs to be able to handle to survive? But just throwing it out as an idea as like, I can't imagine this, it's not good, it's just like not a good argument. People, that argument would have worked just as well defending feudalism, and but we know now how that panned out. Those people were wrong, and we can reasonably infer that people are wrong to just throw out socialist ideas just offhandedly like that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that kind of brings me to another point and a reason that I wanted to make this comparison. And that's because there's an effect in American politics. And I kind of hit on this, when I mentioned about like how very few people have a full and comprehensive political education, for one thing, and how very few people have like a full comprehensive, like horseshoe theory is something you develop early on and you never grow beyond it. And it's a set of blinders that most people wear. And when I say people, I don't just mean like I want to be very clear that I mean people all the way to the top of politic. And it's this idea that the liberals are the far left and the conservatives are the far right. The people who vote for Trump, that's the far right. And the people who, man, they just are diehard blue wave, love them some Joe Biden, are the far left. And so, yeah, when you look at those two people, they're basically the same. And when you get to some of their policies and when you really start deep diving into some things, so I mean, those two ends of the horseshoe must just be the exact same thing without realizing you're looking at the middle of the horseshoe because you don't have the political knowledge to know how much further the spectrum goes on both sides of that.
Yeah.
Like,
so when you're talking about in political theory, right, horseshoe theory gets applied kind of in that way sometimes, although I would say the more common usage is to compare leftists to fascists, right? It's to say, like, look at them, they're saying the same thing. Is they're saying that society is fundamentally sick, and it's that way because of a group of elites who dominate and control society through an undue influence, and the only way to fix this sickness is to get rid of this class of ruling elites and move to some better state and utopia, which is like a very aesthetic criticism because they're both populist, and that's true. That now you can figure out why that's not where that falls apart the minute that you ask who's the group of elites.
mm-hmm.
Because a leftist is going to tell you, oh, well, it's capital owners and they own a sort of thing and they collect, like they're going to give you a Marxist leftist analysis of like capitalism. And importantly, capital owners is a class that people can just not be in. You can collapse it and, in theory, at least, with no violence, right? Like there's no reason anyone has to continue to be a capitalist right now. If you ask a fascist who the elite group is, they're gonna say back in World War II era, they would have said like the Jews, right? The Bolsheviks or whatever. Nowadays it would be like whatever scapegoat is currently
Often
France. Sometimes it's still the Jews, but like other
often
times
it's
like
the globalist, because you don't want to name a certain one because that'll get you in trouble. People will recognize what you're saying, so you say the globalists, and that's general enough that nobody's going to call you out when you usually, yeah, you mean a specific group.
Yeah, and it's usually, like, or, um, academic elites or something who, are controlling our kids through the, educational institution, or, right now they haven't crystallized around one consistently, because they're searching for what sticks essentially. Um, and uh, it could be any number of things ultimately, but you can feel this sort of fishing. It's that same sort of thing, like what group can we throw at the wall that people will stick to.
Yeah, and I agree. And well, and I think like with that, it's the factionalism of the right. The left is factionalized by ideological differences about like what we should do, and the right is factionalized by like who do we have to exterminate to fix the problem. And I agree with you that that's the academic perspective of horseshoe theory. I disagree that entirely the general public perceives it as such. That being said, I might be wrong because my perspective is a little skewed into like rural, political, usually conservative uh, spaces. Well, I say usually, always conservative spaces where the political ignorance level is just way high. Often, it's like I have had so many difficulties in younger conversations, even, but even today in conversations like my parent, it's and stuff like that, of just explaining the concept of anything existing beyond the center, um, to the point of like the idea of like, well, communists aren't just the boogeyman of like something overseas. Like, no, there are communists who live in your own neighborhood who actually really care about your community, and they do not like they didn't like there's this political divide between liberals and communists because no, they're just liberals. All the liberals are just secret communists. And then even on the right, it's
If
like,
only.
yeah, even on the right, there's because like there is different Trump voters. There are Trump voters who are just like like him because he's a populist, because he speaks the way I do, and you know what, I get where he's coming from. And then there are people who are leveraging that element of him to build fascism in the United States. And there's a lot of people who just don't get the difference there between, just regular Joe Schmo who is following a cult of personality and people who are actively trying to build a Christian fascist state that will exterminate people that they want exterminated so that it creates the perfect utopia they're looking for.
I
Um,
I definitely agree with you that there is a sense, a very real and I would say accurate sense that like the Democrats and Republicans have a lot of shared ground, and there is, not enough meaningful difference between the two of them. I personally haven't run into anyone calling it horseshoe theory, although I can kind of see the comparison there. But yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that like people with um what I would say is a deeply neoliberal framing, where who does perceive Joe Biden as far left,
yeah.
um, which, oh man,
It's ridiculous, but it's so damned common.
oh
And
no, yeah, and it's common for sure. I can see how that might seem like that, but then I would wonder like, what do you see as different? Like, to me, I can't imagine anyone stuck in that kind of framing seeing it as anything but just like a line, because like how
yeah.
could it be horseshoe shaped? What's the thing in the middle that you perceive as like good, that's like meaningfully different than the right and the left in your mind? I just I don't, but
Yeah,
I,
and I mean
I
a
may not
lot.
be talking to the people that use the term horseshoe theory in this way.
Yeah, and now, and to be fair, like I would say it's I don't know. I don't know if I've heard it necessarily specifically stated as horseshoe theory, but the concept existing here, and often, and this is something that I even fell into quite a bit before. Like before college, I was, and for admitting this, but I was leaning into like libertarian politics. And I fell into this. I considered myself a true moderate. I didn't, I see some problems with Obama, and I see some problems with McCain. But I'm able to like look at both and see how both are okay. And it's the Trump of the party at that time, and uh the I don't really know who I would have pointed to on but the idea of it's people who are left slightly criticizing Obama were like, oh, they're all the same. Even like during like the 2015 election, which by that time I was very firmly neoliberal. I was a little bit grumpy with some people in the Bernie campaign who were now I would be much more chill with. Um, and at the time, I kind of saw, I was like, oh, God damn it, you're just dragging us into the mud with all this stupid shit that is conspiracy theory conservative shit. And some of it was conspiracy theory conservative shit. There's, the hippie to conservative far right pipeline. There are some people who participated in the 99% rallies in 2008 who then are now in the Trump camp. There are people who were even in the Bernie camp who are now in the Trump camp. Some of those people who are like, like fluoride. Like, I remember it being an issue at a Bernie meeting of like somebody was like, yeah, and Bernie's going to do something about them putting fluoride in the water. And I'm like, oh, God damn it.
Yeah. I mean, I genuinely think people like this have like, well, there's definitely the people who are prone to conspiracy type of thinking, in which case, like, it's self-reinforcing type of thing. You can't, there's a whole set of literature about what to do about those people that's very complicated and difficult. But like, I think a lot of people have this problem where, they're very, very smart people, and they definitely know at some level that there is something wrong, that they're being screwed over, they're being taken advantage of, that society is sick in some way. And when you have the mainstream conservative and the mainstream liberals up on a thing all saying society has got it pretty much figured out, capitalism is the way, the end of history, we've done this thing and it's good, fundamentally it's just a matter of, in the conservative case, freeing it up a little more, and the liberal case, like putting a little bit more restrictions on it, right? If the one thing that is that something is wrong, the first person who comes along, like Trump or whatever, and says like, no, these people are all full of shit, and like, yeah, it's wrong, like it's bad, and society's falling apart, and you should be angry, and it's the immigrants' fault, like, that's wrong, and they should know better in a sort of objective sense. But like, if the only other two options they are presented with are people going, no, you're crazy for thinking that there's something wrong, and they don't have an analysis to understand why Trump is wrong, or why like a right-wing populism analysis is bad, they're probably just going to go with the right-wing populism out of a thing of like, well, I've tried both of these over and over for decades and it keeps failing me, so let's just go with this and hope that maybe it shakes things up and makes things a little bit better, or at least makes room for someone who can come along with a better thing. And that analysis sucks. It's bad, but like, I understand it from the perspective of someone who may not have access to like a clear and well thought out, leftist analysis of capitalism and whatnot.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think for right now, let's have a quick word from our sponsors, of which don't really exist. I just don't pay for Zoom. We'll be right back after something from this sponsor message thing. Yeah. This episode is brought to you by the concept of swaddles. We did an entire episode on them, and I didn't know how amazing they are. Holy shit, y'all, go get a fucking swaddle.
Yeah, that's great.
I really want one of the human-sized swaddles. Like, I just want to be Like, okay, so I think I might even talked about this on one of the other episodes, but I'm going to talk about it again because I can. uh we were like, doing the terrible thing of looking through the internet at comments, and there was a comment section on somebody who had swaddled their baby, and they were like, what if somebody came by and swaddled you? How would you like it? And I'm like, I fucking love it.
That is a extremely weird take on that. Like,
uh,
okay, I just like don't want to get into that, but like, yeah.
but on topic. um so I all of this has been to say, um correct me if I'm wrong here, but horseshoe theory is bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's interesting, like when it comes to like the parenting uh analysis of like the horseshoe theory, of like comparing uh helicopter parenting and latchkey parenting. It strikes me as much more so, like in the two versions we've talked about, sort of like one's comparing the extreme left and extreme right, one's more of a general sense of like it's all the same, it doesn't really matter. um I think that it strikes me as a lot more like the second one, in the sense of like yeah, like both of these are very bad and they have similar outcomes and like all that kind of stuff. Even and you might get the sense of like it doesn't really matter what I do. Like if I do a bunch of intervention, it's just more like helicopter parenting, or if I free my kid up and don't do anything, it's just more like latchkey parenting. They both suck, so like what are you supposed to do? There's no good way to parent, type of thing. And to me, like the solution to both, um the neoliberal framing in politics, or this, other framing in parenting, is to see the frame. You have to note that you've had options cut out from your vision by systems and society and stuff like that, and that the best thing you can do is to try to break out of those, try to find good serious people who are thoughtful and caring, who do good analysis of these things and can find um who can give you good advice about how to approach things in a different way. I like to hope that one day this podcast may help someone in that way, help them see different ways of doing things and different ways of raising children in a way that isn't doesn't require them to instill in them values that will ultimately harm them.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think one of the things that has been most exciting for me over the past few years, I would say the only positive thing post 2020 for me, because a lot of my real political awakening came post 2020. And I've been politically interested or active my whole life, even as a kid. Okay, so I'm going to get into something really dorky. This is a parenting podcast, though, so I'm allowed to talk about this. I was an only child, right? I was also extremely isolated from other children. I really wasn't allowed to have like friends over and stuff. Um, and at one point, I had like this whole like secret organization that I had invented and created and was a part of and was leading, and that it was I don't remember even what it had, like even a stupid leftist acronym. And mind you, I had zero political knowledge of anything whatsoever. My parents didn't. We were not like, my parents were Bush voters at this time. Um, but yeah, it was like some silly acronym about like trying to like liberate children from the tyranny of adults, and give children rights, because children don't have rights, and should have like dictation and control over their own lives. It was pretty fucking based for a 9-year old. And it was just me like just being mad about my situation and venting in no way. But I mean, yeah, like and then when I had a short-lived hip hop career in my teens and early 20s, and it was very political. All of my work was a variety of fuck the police and fuck the systems that we live under. And again, I had no like at that time I would argue that I was like a little neo-libertarian. Like, I definitely wasn't a conservative with my libertarianism, but I saw libertarians as like, the political party that allows you to have guns and weed, and that was what I was after. Um,
Turns out you can still be a leftist.
and
There's
it's
there's a whole leftist pro-gun thing, and also I mean, just I feel like acceptance of weed is just like I guess other than some like authoritarian tanky types, which I would argue aren't even actual leftists,
Yeah.
um, uh, are against weed, but whatever.
And I mean, it was 2020, and having, um, I'll tell you, all the way up until 2020, politics was frustrating for me, even when I engaged it with it, even when I was speaking in a Bernie rally and I was a Democrat and I was very neoliberal. I found politics frustrating because I felt like it was very bottled up. Like, there's only so many things you can think and do, and like, there's no new ideas out here. There's no depth to any of it. All of this seemed shallow and just frustrating and wrong. Like, everything I'm looking at is just inaccurate in one way or another. And it was the summer of 2020, and the fact that I had like 6 months of what was the word, administrative leave because of COVID. So I was unemployed, living at home with a steady check, nothing to do except think about politics, listen to podcasts about politics, and read about politics from like the summer of 2020 all the way really up into like recently. And it opened, like, that was like a huge set of double doors opening up to me of what do you mean, like, these are the only like political, like, this is the only parts of the political spectrum. All of these other elements of the political spectrum exist that I had just never really understood or known anything about, or just had zero exposure to or access to or knowledge of. And to the point where it's like it feels like infinite paths, and I'm still like, like right now I'm reading about like anarcho Judaism, which has just some really cool ass characters historically who were involved with it, and it feels like just constantly I'm turning around and running into some amazing story that should have been the first thing I was ever told, and it was the last thing I was ever told. And it's one of the reasons why I soapbox really hard about this. And it's not about like, quote, being woke to, oh, this bigger world that's been hidden from you. I mean, because like, because I don't mean it as like sounding like conspiratorial or in any kind of a way. It's a functional matter. This happens with literally any topic. I mean, when I went to college for the first time, the idea that classes existed for media production blew my mind. The idea that there was enough that existed about working a soundboard that I could study it and read about it in a book blew my mind. Um, it's and which now seems very silly of me and naive of me, but we're all naive. We all have elements of knowledge that are just locked away that we've never looked at, had a chance to get to. And this is one of the reasons I would argue that 6 months of anybody being able to stay at home while getting paid to do so and just learn is one of the most valuable things that can happen in anybody's life. And we should break capitalism and wage labor so that more people can do that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that, you know, obviously having lots of free time gives you the capacity to do a lot of things. Uh, and I would say, like, just in general, like the problems that people have with that, or rather, like some things you might point to, like you could equally just as go down a bad rabbit hole of like fascist ideology on your own in 6 months, with no input. But like the reason that people do that is they exist in a current environment that encourages and drives them in that direction, for reasons that ultimately boil down to, it's profitable for someone, for those people to do that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think in general, just being able to escape out of a framing to see the previously invisible, or to denormalize the previously normal, is an important step in people, opening their eyes to some of the things that are not hidden from them, but simply put out of frame. Uh, it's much easier to get people to ignore something by making it irrelevant rather than book burnings are obvious,
Hmm.
uh, you get a bunch of backlash when you do that kind of thing from all the people that know how bad that book is. If you just leave the books in the library shelf and never talk about them, don't encourage people to read them, don't talk about um, don't talk about them, and kind of just maybe a little thing of like, oh yeah, that's like a silly book that silly people read or whatever, is good enough, and actually much more stable than trying to destroy an idea, which often backfires. um,
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, and a lot of this can be applied to parenting. And, it's a thing that you get told a lot in parenting. I feel like when you talk about, like, no, I want to do something a little bit radical. I want to try to do something different and, give my kid more freedom, give them more um, capability to grow and learn and become their own individual. You'll get, people who be like, yeah, you think that now, but, nobody's ever actually, ran a country on that principle and had it succeed. I'm referencing anarchism there. Um, and it's a thing that happens to you in parenting every time you kind of, well, I want to be a little revolutionary and try to do something different. And I've been reading about all of these other, parenting groups who did some of the same kind of a thing and it worked really well for them. And people will just kind of like, well, good luck with that. Your life's going to be miserable. Just deal with it. Their life's going to be miserable. Deal with it. And it's a thing that you have to kind of break through, I think, as a parent, and
yeah, I mean,
recognize.
a really good example of this is people talking about trans issues and children. Like the amount of times that you can find even like fairly progressive parents being like, um, well, it's just very confusing, it's a very confusing thing to understand, like the differences between gender and sex and how people can identify one way and like be different ways. Like it's just really complicated and it's going to confuse a lot of children, and they're going to have a lot of this like um, self-doubt and uncertainty, and it's going to cause them a lot of like, pain and confusion and all that kind of stuff. It's better to just kind of leave that for when they get a little bit older, and they can approach that kind of is like an example of how they kind of get people to sort of like forget and leave that to the side, and fail to introduce that until it gets to a point that once it's introduced, it then feels alien and weird and out there, in a way that serves kind of the narrative of how those things in society. Um, and just from practical experience, it's not. It's I my children from a very young age know many trans people, and have we've had conversations about that, you know, about what trans people are, and uh, obviously those conversations are simplified, um, as is any conversation about any moral or social issue with a child. You have to meet them where they're at, and sometimes that involves incomplete metaphors or things like that. But the fundamental reality is that like you emphasize at the center of them acceptance, and you emphasize at the center of them that there are lots of ways to be, and it's okay if you feel that way, and it's okay if you don't feel that way. And they're not confused. It's not like my kid does not go like, we talked about this and I don't know now if I'm a boy or a girl, it's so confusing. Like they go like, no, I feel like boy, this feels right, I feel okay with my body, like it's whatever. I don't experience any of those things, so that doesn't seem like me. But if they do hit puberty, right, and they start to have feelings they didn't have before, right, and I do end up having a daughter where I thought I had a son, right, then they have something to explain what's going on and understand it. It's not just this really confusing bundle of mess of emotions, and B, they know that they can talk to me about it and I'll be accepting of it. And it's like the narrative of like this being confusing is a way that they kind of like put it out of frame, The minute someone looks at it, they go like, well, that's kind of like older kid stuff at most. Like if you even need to do it, they'll figure it out, kind of attitude is how that kind of appears in parenting.
Yeah, I agree completely. Like having and that's yeah, that's the tie together of these two frameworks and why I think it's important to talk about this podcast with like this kind of a twin beam of, one beam being politics and the other beam being parenting. I think there's these crossovers happen so much and are happening so much in our world right now that yeah. Um so, sorry, my brain is starting to shut down. It's past my bedtime, which means it's time to wrap up.
Your
Uh,
bedtime's gotten a lot earlier
I
lately
know.
for some reason.
I don't know what's happening, but I just suddenly only sleep from 8 to 2 and then intermittently afterwards. Um, so where could they find this podcast we're making, Philip?
Well, if you're listening to it, you can obviously find it where you already found it. If that happens
What?
to be, if that happens to be YouTube, I would encourage you to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell to make sure that you get notified every time we put up a new episode. I did it and it works. So uh, if you are just a listener, you can find us wherever, or you want to, listen to us sometimes when you can't watch a video or whatever. You can find us anywhere where you can find podcasts. And if you really like our podcast, you want to support us and join a community that is about progressive parenting and figuring out how to go through this crazy experience while also sort of standing and fighting against the current hegemony of society. You can support us financially on patreon.com/racismleft. You can join our Discord, and we will use all of that to support either stuff for this podcast directly or just leftist projects in general. So if you really like it and you want to support us, check us out on Patreon.
Yep, I agree. And as always, reach out to whatever local organizations you have in your community. There are things, people everywhere doing things. As much as we just talked about having having the doors open to all kinds of political ideas that I didn't know existed, having the doors open to political organizations that existed in my community I never knew about. There are people doing amazing, cool stuff wherever you are. I promise. So look them up. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever other time of day it is. Thank you. Bye.